If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, then you should check out my other podcast, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries. Each week, I dive into some of the most bizarre, mind-bending medical stories you've ever heard. Cases that leave doctors scratching their heads, miraculous recoveries that defy logic, and strange medical mishaps that seem too wild to be real. These stories are more than just eerie. They are a reminder of how unpredictable and sometimes terrifying life can be. Up next is one of my recent favorites from the series. Whether you're new to MrBallen's Medical Mysteries or a longtime listener, I think you'll find it just as captivating as I did. If you like this content, make sure to follow MrBallen's Medical Mysteries on Amazon Music or wherever you get your podcasts. We put out new episodes every week, and each one dives into a bizarre, mind-bending medical mystery that will leave you questioning what you thought you knew about the human body. In the winter of 2022, a mom in her mid-30s sat in the bleachers at the local ice hockey rink, cheering on her 6-year-old son. She always enjoyed watching these hockey games. The kids were adorable as they slipped around the ice, trying to control the hockey puck. Her son was small for his age. He was so tiny, she almost hadn't signed him up for the team again this year. But he loved hockey and his teammates, so she didn't have the heart to say no. The mom clapped and hollered when her son got the puck and started skating toward the opposite goal. Then he swung his stick and the puck went sailing past the other team's goalie. Her son threw his arms up in celebration, and then he suddenly crumpled to the ice in pain. Fear ran through the mother as she heard her son's wail. Nobody had touched him. All he'd done was swing a stick and raise his arms. But he was crying so hard, it was like he'd broken a bone or cracked his head open on the ice. The referee skated over to the boy to see what was wrong as the mother raced down the bleachers to her son's side. She didn't know if she should call him an ambulance or just tell him to snap out of it. But judging from how loud he was screaming, the pain he was feeling was very real. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. So if you like today's story, the next time you're in the Follow Button's house, secretly replace all the pictures hanging up on their walls with a slice of square cheese. This episode is called 17 Doctors. During the COVID-19 lockdown in 2020, Caroline Daniels stood in her backyard in suburban Iowa, watching her husband, Brian, blow up a small bouncy house that she just bought on Amazon. Brian had nearly gotten the thing inflated. They'd all been cooped up in the house for over a month because of the pandemic, so it was a godsend that the weather was nice and they'd gotten something fun for the kids to do outside. The moment the bouncy house was inflated, Andrew and Robin went running to it and piled inside with their dad. They screamed and giggled as their father bounced around them, launching them a few feet into the air every time. Caroline smiled and went back into the kitchen, where their nanny was cutting up some veggie sticks for a snack. She was about to grab a knife and help when the screaming outside turned from fun to painful. Caroline dashed back outside and found her husband kneeling next to Andrew. The little 4-year-old was curled up on his side, sobbing with pain. Caroline helped Brian scoop Andrew into his arms, then followed them inside. Brian laid Andrew on the sofa in the living room so that he and Caroline could try to figure out if the boy had any broken bones. But after a minute of prodding, Caroline felt sure that nothing was seriously wrong. Besides, Brian assured her that Andrew hadn't landed hard or anything. He just bounced a little, then started screaming. This whole situation definitely seemed odd, but Caroline assumed that, he must have just landed at an odd angle or something. She gave him some Motrin to help with the pain, and after a few minutes, Andrew did calm down. And by dinner time, he was back to his usual happy-go-lucky self. By the following morning, Caroline had put the whole bouncy house incident out of her mind. She left Brian watching the kids while she hopped on a morning Zoom call for work. Halfway through the call, though, Caroline heard a piercing scream in the yard. It was Andrew again. She turned off her camera and raced downstairs. By the time she got to the backyard, the nanny was kneeling beside Andrew, who was once again in the fetal position and crying. Caroline asked if Andrew had fallen down, but the nanny said no. He was just standing there, and then he suddenly yelped and fell to the ground, and Andrew had been crying ever since. Caroline couldn't tell if Andrew was truly in pain or if he was just having a meltdown. She picked up her son and asked what was wrong, but it was clear he was in no mood to talk. He just cried. Caroline wasn't sure what to make of it. Andrew was not the kind of little boy to throw temper tantrums, but she also knew that every child gets overwhelmed sometimes. Besides, he hadn't seen his friends in months because of the COVID lockdown, and he was tired of being at home all the time, and so Caroline decided he must just be having a moment. Still, she gave him another Motrin, and about 15 minutes later, Andrew was back to normal. It suddenly occurred to Caroline that Andrew's molars might be coming in, which could be extremely painful. Once he was outside playing with the nanny again, she picked up the phone to call his dentist. A few weeks later, an orthodontist named Dr. Tyson Graham sat down on a stool in his treatment room and turned to face little Andrew, who was sitting up in the examination chair. Andrew's mom was in the corner, looking anxious. Dr. Graham smiled at her, then explained to Andrew how he was going to try to help the little boy with the pain he'd been experiencing lately. Andrew's regular dentist had already taken x-rays of Andrew's mouth and found that Andrew had been grinding his teeth at night. Teeth grinding can cause difficulty breathing at night, and the dentist thought that might explain why Andrew had been so moody and exhausted recently. He wasn't sleeping well. So the dentist had referred Andrew to Dr. Graham, thinking that the orthodontist might find a way to prevent the boy's teeth grinding. But as Dr. Graham examined Andrew's mouth, he found a different issue. Andrew's palate, the roof of his mouth, was too narrow for his age. In Dr. Graham's opinion, that, not teeth grinding, was what was making it difficult for Andrew to breathe at night. He turned to Caroline and explained that if Andrew had a wider palate, he'd very likely feel better. They could put an expander in Andrew's mouth for a couple of months to push the palate out. Caroline looked nervous, but Dr. Tyson explained that the expander wasn't that different from getting braces, and it would definitely help Andrew breathe better. Caroline still looked unsure, but she agreed. Dr. Graham nodded and then went to get a few supplies to install the palate expander. A month later, Caroline squeezed into the bathroom with Andrew and Robin, squirting little dabs of bubblegum toothpaste onto their toothbrushes. Then all three of them brushed their teeth together, a little bedtime routine they'd fallen into recently. Mostly, this was so Caroline could make sure they actually did it, but it was also to make sure Andrew used the special mouthwash she had bought him to keep his palate expander nice and clean. Caroline was tired, and she could tell her kids were exhausted too. They'd spent all day outside, playing a socially distanced version of hide-and-seek they'd made up with the neighborhood kids. Caroline was glad to see Andrew back to his old self. It seemed like the palate expander had really worked. As the kids got into their pajamas, Andrew asked if his mother would measure them against the doorframe in their bedroom. Caroline smiled. She had been marking their heights there since they were old enough to stand. Robin chimed in that she wanted to be measured too. Caroline knew why there was suddenly all this interest in being measured. The neighborhood kids had been bragging about how tall they'd gotten, so of course her kids wanted to know too. Caroline told Robin to stand against the door jamb and carefully marked her height with a pencil. When Robin stepped away, it looked like she had grown a full inch since they'd last measured her. Caroline wrote the date on the jamb as Robin grinned. Then it was Andrew's turn. But after she measured him and Andrew stepped away, it looked like he had barely grown at all. Andrew frowned, looking at his sister's mark with a tinge of jealousy. Caroline assured him he would grow by next month, but she knew this was unusual for a 4-year-old kid. He should be growing like a weed. And so she decided she would make an appointment with a pediatrician in the morning, just to make sure nothing was wrong. But later that week, Caroline felt frustrated as she paced her kitchen, listening while Andrew's pediatrician explained over the phone that Andrew was not growing because of the pandemic. The stress of all the isolation and fear was negatively affecting Andrew's growth, and unfortunately, because they were still in the pandemic, there really wasn't much they could do. They should just wait it out for a few months. But as she hung up the phone, she felt certain that something was wrong with Andrew, and it had nothing to do with COVID-19. In early 2021, about 9 months after Andrew first started experiencing these sudden bouts of extreme pain, Caroline took him back to his pediatrician for a follow-up. She let Andrew walk ahead of her into the office. She intentionally trailed behind him a little so she could watch his stride. She saw he was dragging his left foot instead of picking it up and actually stepping with it. He'd been doing this whole past week. It was like his right foot was doing all the walking and his left foot was just along for the ride. At this point, it was another symptom to add to the list. Over the past few months, Andrew had been having headaches and meltdowns again. Besides that, he seemed exhausted all the time. The Motrin still helped somewhat, but Caroline could see him getting more solemn and less playful with each passing day. She knew her baby was in pain, and it had to be due to something other than his narrow palate or the pandemic. Caroline had taken him to several doctors, trying to get some answers. A neurologist had told her that Andrew had migraines, while an ear, nose, and throat doctor still believed her son was having breathing issues while sleeping, and so he likely couldn't fall into a deep, undisturbed sleep, which explained why he was so tired. But to Caroline, none of these doctors were addressing the root problem. She felt like each doctor was focusing on one single symptom, but nobody was taking a step back to see the whole picture. What was the underlying condition or disease that was causing all these symptoms? And until somebody could put all the puzzle pieces together, Andrew would be the one suffering. But no matter how many times she tried to communicate this with all the doctors and specialists, it was like nobody seemed to understand. Caroline felt like she was losing her mind, but all she could do was just keep going to more doctors. And so she'd taken Andrew back to his pediatrician's office, hoping maybe he might finally have a real answer for her. While the pediatrician measured Andrew's height and weight, Caroline went through all of Andrew's symptoms. She expected the doctor to offer some kind of overarching explanation. Instead, he just stood upright and told her there was good news. Andrew had grown a bit since his last appointment. Caroline supposed that was good, but the rest of Andrew's symptoms showed no improvement whatsoever. And on the whole, Andrew wasn't feeling good. He was still in pain. And now there was this lazy foot issue. She wanted to know how they could start actively helping her son, instead of just tracking all his symptoms. The pediatrician suggested that Caroline put her son in physical therapy to correct his foot imbalance. He promised to write a referral. Caroline thanked him, though secretly she felt overwhelmed by how many appointments this would likely add to their already doctor-heavy calendar. But it just felt like there was nothing else she could do. She had to go through with it. So she smiled and promised the doctor she would get Andrew into therapy soon. Later that week, while Andrew was going through his physical therapy routine, Caroline, who was in the room watching him, felt uneasy. Andrew's therapist, Miss Ashley, was walking Andrew through an examination. Caroline smiled as Andrew walked around the room with a determined look on his face. Miss Ashley took notes and told him he was doing a great job. Then Miss Ashley asked him to sit cross-legged on the floor. Andrew tried, but he couldn't quite get his legs to cross over one another. One leg would bend, but he couldn't bend his other leg enough to sit upright. Before long, he got frustrated and told Miss Ashley he couldn't do it. Miss Ashley said that was okay, and then they moved on to other activities. After a session was over, Andrew came running over to his mom, and Caroline scooped him up. She let him rest his head on her shoulder, and then Miss Ashley came over and explained that Andrew might have a congenital condition called Chiari malformation. That's when a part of the brain, called the cerebellum, bulges through an opening at the back of the skull, right where the skull joins the spinal canal. The bulge puts pressure on the cerebellum and the spinal cord. It can cause severe headaches, scoliosis, and sleep apnea, which is when breathing becomes interrupted during sleep. If Andrew did have a Chiari malformation, he could need surgery. The thought sent a shiver through Caroline. She never thought that Andrew might need to be cut open. She hated picturing it, and she had no idea how she was going to explain it to him. The following winter, in 2022, Caroline was in Andrew's bedroom helping him into his pajamas, the same pair of red flannel pajamas that he'd been wearing for 2 years now. It felt like his sister Robin outgrew her clothes every few months, but Andrew hadn't needed new pajamas or t-shirts since before COVID. Andrew was 6 years old now, but he still looked like he was closer to 4, and this evening he was throwing a tantrum like a bona fide toddler. But Caroline didn't blame him. After dinner, she and Brian had taken Andrew out for ice cream and broke the news. Because of what was going on with him, he had to quit his hockey team. The skating was causing too much pain in his knees and back. It was just too much for his underdeveloped body. At first, Caroline just felt heartbroken for making Andrew so sad. But now, she was so frustrated, she was becoming angry at all the doctors. She was tired of having to tell Andrew that nobody knew why his body was failing him. The latest theory, that Andrew had Chiari malformation, wasn't right either. Andrew had tested negative for the condition last year. Since then, Caroline and Brian had taken their son to countless more specialists. A new pediatrician for a second opinion, a pediatric internist, even an adult internist, just in case they found something different. In total, Andrew had seen 17 different doctors over the last 3 years. But all those doctors were still stuck in a cycle of treating his symptoms individually. Caroline finally got Andrew into bed, though it broke her heart to leave him red-faced and tear-streaked, his little arms wrapped around his favorite stuffed animal. She went downstairs and started scrolling on her phone just to decompress. A Facebook friend had posted an article that looked interesting about a new artificial intelligence software called ChatGPT. You could ask it any question, no matter how complex, and it would scan the whole internet in a matter of seconds to generate an answer. People were using it to create marketing plans for their companies, to write blog posts, and to make mashups like fairy tales written in the style of a mafia movie, or resignation letters if they were written by famous TV characters. It seemed like a fun way to spend an hour, so Caroline started messing around with ChatGPT. When Brian came into the living room and sat down next to her on the sofa, she read him some of the funniest mashups it had made. Brian laughed and then joked that she should try to use it to diagnose Andrew. Caroline laughed dismissively, but then she wondered. It was a long shot, but why not? Maybe ChatGPT would find some rare, obscure disease that most specialists had never heard of. Or maybe it would unearth some clue, some pivotal question to ask that would help one of his doctors see the whole picture. The worst that could happen was nothing, really. So Caroline started typing all of Andrew's symptoms into ChatGPT. She even went and got her copy of medical notes from an MRI he'd gotten and typed them in, line by line. It was a tedious process, especially doing it on her phone, but eventually when she was done, she hit enter and waited. A few moments later, the little text box started suggesting possible answers, but they were all conditions that Andrew had already been tested for. Caroline's heart sank. She felt stupid for thinking this brand new internet AI chat box could magically diagnose her child, but then she realized she actually had left out one of his symptoms, the fact that he could no longer sit cross-legged. She told ChatGPT to redo the search, including that symptom, and within moments, it suggested a condition that she'd never heard of, and none of Andrew's doctors had ever mentioned it either. But as she started reading the symptoms of this condition aloud, Brian sat up straight, his eyes going wide. He ran to get his laptop, and Caroline started researching on her phone. Eventually, she found a Facebook group for families living with and caring for those with this condition, and to her surprise, their stories were nearly identical to Andrew's. A week later, Caroline was bursting with anticipation as she sat next to Andrew in a brand new doctor's office. They were waiting to see Dr. Hannah Gordon, a pediatric neurosurgeon. Caroline had brought a packet of research with her and had it waiting on her lap for when the doctor came in. She hoped that by the end of the appointment, Dr. Gordon would be able to officially diagnose Andrew and that Caroline would finally know what was wrong with her son. When Dr. Gordon finally came into the exam room, Caroline introduced herself and explained that usually she was not one to surf the internet and self-diagnose, but she'd actually found some compelling evidence online, and then she handed over the research packet she'd compiled and she watched the doctor read over it. When Dr. Gordon laid eyes on Andrew's MRI scans, she smiled and told Caroline that she was fairly certain she did know how to help Andrew. Dr. Gordon explained that Andrew was suffering from a condition called tethered cord syndrome, the same condition that ChatGPT had identified. The spinal cord runs like a cable through the bones that make up the spine, from the base of the skull to the tailbone. However, in rare cases, the spinal cord improperly attaches itself to something inside the bones of the spinal column. As a result, the spinal cord's movement is limited. In short, it gets stuck. Andrew's spinal cord was stuck to one of those growing spinal bones, causing him extreme pain and all his other symptoms. It was also why he couldn't sit cross-legged, a symptom that's so common among people with tethered cord syndrome that ChatGPT recognized the pattern. Caroline believes that ChatGPT was able to diagnose Andrew because it was doing the very thing she had spent years asking doctors to do. It took a step back and considered all of Andrew's symptoms, instead of picking and choosing or focusing on them one by one. Luckily for Andrew, he was able to undergo surgery to detach his spinal cord from where it was stuck. Once the tension was gone, Andrew's symptoms soon disappeared, and he went back to his happy-go-lucky self. For real this time. On Saturday, November 16th, 1991, a 17-year-old high school senior named Crystal Todd was in her bedroom getting ready to go to a party in the small town she lived in, which was called Conway, South Carolina. Crystal looked at herself in the mirror and put the finishing touches on her makeup. Then she stepped back to get a full view of herself. She was wearing a print shirt, jeans, brown leather shoes, and her favorite brown leather jacket. And in the mirror, her blue eyes shined. Her mom always told her that her eyes were bluer than the sky, and they lit up any room she walked into. After checking herself over a few more times, Crystal felt happy with how she looked, and she was about to head out for the night when the phone in her bedroom started to ring. She answered it, but right away she wished that she hadn't. A young man named Davey, who Crystal had gone out with on a few dates, was the caller. Crystal had told Davey that she did not want to see him anymore, but clearly he had not gotten the message. Davey asked Crystal if she wanted to go out with him that night, but Crystal said she already had plans, so she couldn't. So Davey said, "Okay, well, can we get together another time soon?" Crystal had always been taught to be polite, so she took a deep breath and in a sweet voice told Davey again that she did not think they should see each other anymore, but she hoped they could still be friends. Then Crystal hung up the phone, grabbed her purse, and headed into the living room where her mom was sitting on the couch. She told her mom that she was going out and gave her a hug. Her mom reminded her to be home by 12:30, and Crystal just smiled and nodded. Crystal almost never missed her curfew, and even if she was going to be home just a few minutes late, she always called her mom ahead of time to let her know. So Crystal said goodbye to her mom and stepped outside onto the large wooden porch in front of their traditional country-style house. Then Crystal walked across the yard to her new blue Toyota Celica car parked out front. She climbed into the driver's seat, started the car, and immediately felt a rush of excitement. Crystal loved this car. It had been an early graduation present from her mom. Her mom had even gotten her vanity license plates that read, "C. Todd." Crystal leaned across the passenger seat, opened up the glove compartment, and grabbed a cassette tape from inside. She put the tape into her stereo, turned the music up loud, and then pulled away from her house and turned onto a tree-lined road that led toward the center of town. Just being behind the wheel of her beautiful new car gave Crystal a sense of freedom that she rarely felt in this small town where almost everyone knew everyone else's business. And as she drove, she looked out at the dense woods that surrounded most of Conway and thought about what her life would be like once she finally left her hometown. Crystal loved her mom and her friends, but she dreamed of driving her new car out of Conway and going to college in another city where she could finally meet some new people and have some new experiences. Crystal finally reached the center of town and drove past the shopping mall and a few fast food restaurants. Then she turned onto a side road, and after following that road for a few miles, she arrived at the house where the party was going to be that night. When Crystal stepped inside the house was already packed with teenagers, and music was blaring from the stereo. One of Crystal's friends immediately came up to her and asked if she was meeting Davey there. Crystal frowned and said no, she was not, and she actually hoped Davey would not show up to this party at all. But Crystal would tell this friend that there actually was another guy Crystal was hoping to see at this party. But when Crystal's friend asked her who this guy was, Crystal just smiled and didn't say anything, like she was keeping a big secret. Then Crystal poured herself a beer into a red plastic cup and stepped away into the crowded living room. Crystal was fairly short. She was only 5'3" tall, so once she was in the room, she got up on her toes and craned her neck to see over everybody in the room, but she didn't see the guy she was hoping to see. So she weaved her way through the crowd and found her way to the living room couch. For the next couple of hours, Crystal sat right there drinking a beer, periodically scanning the crowd in hopes of seeing this new guy, but he never appeared. And as Crystal scanned the room that night, she started to become more and more aware of all the happy couples dancing and talking to each other, and it started to make her feel really lonely. And as she started to feel lonely, she suddenly wished that her really good friend, Ken Register, had been there that night. Ken and Crystal had been friends since they were kids, and whenever they were together, Crystal never seemed to get bored. But Ken had graduated a year earlier, and he made it a point now not to hang out at high school parties. Finally, at around 11 p.m., when still this guy had not shown up to the party, Crystal got up from the couch, she made her rounds around the house saying goodbye to her friends, and then she headed back outside. The music from the party faded as she got into her blue car, and then after firing up the engine, she began driving back toward the center of town along the dark road. After a few minutes, Crystal passed the mall's brightly lit parking lot and then glanced at the clock on her dashboard. It was only 11:15, which meant she had a little over an hour before she had to be home for curfew. And Crystal was not about to waste an hour of freedom, so she decided she would at least go out and get some fast food before heading home. After driving a little further down the road, in the direction of the nearest fast food restaurant, Crystal eased off the gas and stopped at a traffic light. She turned up her music even louder and started singing out loud, but then she heard a car horn blaring over the music. She thought she must have missed the green light, but when she looked up, she saw it was still red. She heard the horn again and realized the car that was honking was right next to her. Crystal looked out her passenger side window at this other car, and when she saw who was driving it, she immediately smiled and waved, and the other driver rolled down their window, and Crystal did the same. She rolled down her passenger side window. Then the other driver, while shouting over the music, asked if Crystal wanted to hang out. Crystal's smile instantly grew much wider, and she said yes, definitely. She had about an hour until she had to go home. A moment later, the light turned green, so Crystal drove forward and pulled into the parking lot of a nearby middle school and parked. The other driver followed her. Crystal grabbed her keys and got out of her car, but left her purse behind. Then she made her way over to this other driver's car, she hopped in the passenger seat, and they took off. At 1 a.m. on November 17th, so about 2 hours after Crystal had left that party, her friend, Ken Register, who she had hoped would be at that party with her, was getting ready for bed. Ken had worked his construction job all week and then spent the previous night with his girlfriend at the go-kart track. He was exhausted and he knew he still had to get up early for church. But before he could lie down in bed, his telephone rang. He figured it must be his girlfriend calling to say goodnight, so he reached over and grabbed the phone, but right away he knew it was not his girlfriend and something was terribly wrong. Crystal's mom was the one calling him, and she was frantic. She said Crystal still was not home and had not called her to say she'd be late. And so Crystal's mom asked Ken if he knew where she was or if he had seen her that night. Ken told her that he had not been with Crystal that night, so he didn't know where she was, but he reassured her that, Crystal was probably just out with friends and had lost track of time and would be home soon. But nothing Ken said seemed to calm Crystal's mother down. Instead, she just kept saying, "Ken, I really think something is wrong. She's never late. And if she's going to be, she always calls." And so Ken, who had known Crystal's mom since he was a little kid and could really tell this was a crisis point for her, he told her, "Look, I'll call the 2 closest hospitals and see if maybe she's in one of those." And so Crystal's mom thanked Ken, and he told her he would call her right back after he called the hospitals. After Ken hung up with Crystal's mom, he would call both hospitals, but neither had any records of Crystal ever having come in that night. So Ken called Crystal's mom back and gave her the news, but he told her again that, Crystal was fine. She likely just lost track of time, or maybe she got sucked into dropping someone off who lived far away, but don't worry, she'll be home, everything's fine. Crystal's mom was not buying it, but she did say to Ken that while he was calling the hospitals, she had called the police, and they too told her that this did not seem like a big deal, and that likely Crystal would be home soon. Ken felt terrible for Crystal's mom, but there really wasn't much else he could do, and so eventually they both just said, "Okay, we'll be in touch if we hear from Crystal," and then they hung up, and a little while later, Ken was asleep. At around 9 a.m., 8 hours after Crystal's mom had called Ken, 2 brothers in their 20s were driving down a road in Conway in their pickup truck. The older of the 2 was driving, while the younger brother was scanning the woods outside. He was looking for a good spot to start their deer hunt for the day. And just then, the younger brother said he saw something. So the older brother, who was driving, pulled over to the side of the road and parked, and then after they both got out, the older brother expected the younger brother to head towards the woods to show him what he saw. But instead, the younger brother walked ahead in the middle of the road and stopped over this big stain on the ground. and when the older brother walked up next to him, they both looked down and they could see clearly it was a huge pool of dried blood. In fact, there was so much blood on the concrete that the brothers thought maybe some big wild predator must have attacked a deer in the area, and they both worried that maybe this wild predator was still close by. But then the younger brother pointed to a trail of blood that led from the road to a nearby ditch about 10 feet away. The men looked at each other and then followed the blood trail, and when they got to the other side of the road and looked down into this ditch that was about 5 feet deep, what they saw at the bottom stunned them both into silence. Finally, the older brother snapped out of his daze and started running back towards the truck, and his younger brother followed him. The two of them climbed into the truck, and before long they were peeling out of there, speeding down the road as fast as they could to alert the police. A little after 10 a.m., so about an hour after those brothers made a 911 call, Detective Bill Knowles of the Horry County Police parked his car on the side of the road near the woods and stared out his window at the other police officers who were gathered around the ditch on the opposite side of the road where the brothers had made their ghastly discovery. Knowles stepped out of his car and stretched. It was sunny and very mild that morning. Then, as soon as he was out of his car, one of the officers spotted him and waved him over to the ditch. Knowles walked slowly across the road, staring down at the massive trail of dried blood. Then he reached the officer and looked down into the ditch below. Knowles' breath caught in his chest, and a look of complete shock crossed his face. He had known he was coming to investigate a murder, but the brutality that had been inflicted on the victim he was now staring at was beyond anything he'd seen before. The victim had suffered multiple stab wounds, and whoever killed this person had been filled with a level of rage that Knowles could barely comprehend. Knowles asked the other officers at the scene if they had any details about who the victim was, but they told him that they hadn't located any identification or any vehicle nearby that might help them determine who this person was. So Knowles climbed into the ditch, he crouched down closer to the body, and began inspecting them. He saw there was a gold high school ring on the victim's right hand, so he asked one of the officers to take the ring off. The officer slipped on a pair of gloves and gently removed the ring. Then he held the ring up so he and Knowles could get a better look, and in the sunlight they could read the engraving on the inside of the ring clearly. It said, Crystal Todd. Knowles had children of his own, and so seeing this young woman whose life had been stolen from her really hit him hard. And so right there in the ditch, he leaned over Crystal's body and he quietly promised her he would find whoever had done this and he would bring them to justice. Then Knowles climbed out of the ditch and walked back towards his car. Officers would stay back at the scene to collect blood samples from the victim and from the road, and those samples would be passed on to forensics labs in the area to be tested. But Knowles knew those tests took time, and he wanted to start working right away. So he got into his car and he drove off, determined to keep the promise he had just made to that poor girl. Not long after leaving the crime scene, Knowles pulled up in front of Crystal's house, and he saw Crystal's mom pacing back and forth and smoking on the large wooden porch. He could tell she had not slept all night. Knowles dreaded this part of the job more than anything, but he wanted to make sure Crystal's mom learned about her daughter from him before everybody else in town heard the news. So Knowles took a deep breath, he stepped out of his car, and he approached her. He was tall and in his 30s, with a kind face and a warm demeanor, and when Crystal's mom saw him, she smiled, thinking he might have good news for her. But when Knowles reached her, he put his hands on her shoulders, and a grave look came across his face. And Crystal's mom knew her daughter was gone, and she started crying. In a gentle voice, Knowles told her that they had found Crystal's body, and he said how sorry he was for her loss. Then he made the same promise to her that he'd made to her daughter. He would find the person who had done this. Knowles said he hated to put her through anything else that morning, but he asked her if she could tell him anything about the night before that might help him figure out what had happened to her daughter. Crystal's mom could barely think. She was crying and her hands were trembling, and so she took a long drag on her cigarette and just tried to clear her mind for a second. Then she told Knowles that Crystal had gone to a party the night before and she hadn't come home for curfew. She said she had called around and nobody had seen or heard from Crystal, and one of her friends, Ken, had even called a couple of hospitals to see if maybe she was there, but she wasn't. And then after that, Crystal's mom just said she couldn't remember anything and she went back to smoking. Knowles told Crystal's mother again how sorry he was, and then he turned and walked back to his car. Crystal's mom watched him drive away from the house, and then she went back inside and collapsed on the couch, sobbing. Then she reached over and grabbed the phone and called Ken. On the other line, when Ken heard the news, he was totally devastated. With his voice cracking, he said he would come by as soon as possible. He would be with her so that Crystal's mom would not be alone. Not long after Knowles left Crystal's house, he got word that Crystal's car had been located. It was found in the middle school parking lot. So Knowles headed in that direction. When he arrived, he met several other officers in that parking lot, and he hoped Crystal's car could offer some clues as to what happened. The thing that struck Knowles immediately about the car was that there was no sign of a break-in or a struggle, and Crystal's purse was still in the passenger seat. To Knowles, that indicated that Crystal had parked there under her own free will, and that her murder had likely not been the result of a robbery. Knowles hoped that Crystal's friends might be able to shed some light on how Crystal had gotten from her car in the middle school parking lot to the road where her body had been found. And he knew on Sunday evenings, almost all of the teenagers in town got together to hang out in the mall parking lot. So later that day, as the sun started to set over the woods, Knowles headed to the mall. By the time he got there, news of Crystal's murder had spread all through town, and the local teenagers had gathered together at the mall, just like Knowles figured they would. But instead of making plans or talking about school, the teenagers were discussing what had happened to their friend Crystal. Knowles parked his car, stepped outside, and walked towards a group of kids who were leaning against a car nearby. He introduced himself and asked if any of them had known Crystal. He was not surprised that basically all of them said they either knew her well or had at least spent some time with her in school. Then Knowles asked if any of them had been to the party where Crystal was the night before, or if they had heard anything about what had happened the night before. One of the young women nearby chimed in and said that she heard that Crystal had been murdered as part of a satanic ritual. Knowles sighed and shook his head. The last thing he needed was some crazy rumor about Satanists spreading through town. But then another girl said she was at the party the night before and that Crystal had hoped to meet a guy there. Knowles asked who this guy was, but none of the kids seemed to know. Then the girl said there was another guy who might have gone looking for Crystal the night before. She said his name was Davy and that Crystal had broken up with him after a few dates and he was really angry about it. And all of the other kids in the group agreed. Davy was someone Knowles should talk to. So Knowles got all of the information he could about Davy from this group of teenagers. Then he told them all to be careful, and he headed back to his car. The kids had told Knowles that Davy lived in a nearby town, and back at the station, Knowles got an address. And Knowles had connections in the police force in the neighboring town, so he contacted them and told them what was happening. They said they would round up Davy for him and that Knowles could question him at their police station. And so later that night, Knowles drove out of Conway towards this nearby town, and he was already starting to form a picture of what he thought could have happened based on the crime scene and how he had found Crystal's car. Knowles believed Crystal had parked her car at the middle school by choice and then gotten into another car with someone she knew, and he thought there was a strong possibility that whoever was driving that other car was the person who had killed her. And considering the violence that had been inflicted on Crystal, Knowles thought he was most likely looking for a young man who was angry with her. And Davy, a teenage boy who Crystal had rejected, definitely fit that description. A little while later, and Knowles had finally arrived at the neighboring town's police station. When he got there, an officer from the local force greeted him and told him that Davy was ready for questioning. The officer also said when they picked Davy up, they discovered the exterior and interior of his truck had just been washed, and that the boy had been carrying a pocket knife. Then the officer led Knowles through the station into a small interrogation room where Davy was seated behind a wooden table. The room was very bright and very cold. Knowles took a seat and stared across the table at Davy. Davy was 18 years old, tall and wiry, and he couldn't stop shifting around in his chair. Knowles' expression was blank, and he didn't give away anything he was thinking. Then, in a calm voice, he asked if Davy had killed Crystal. Davy shifted more in his chair and tapped his foot on the ground. He didn't look up at Knowles, but he said he had nothing to do with any crime. He said he'd called Crystal the day before to see if she wanted to go out with him, but she had said she already had plans. Not totally buying his answer, Knowles pushed a little more and asked if Davy made a habit of washing his truck on Sunday evenings. Then, for the first time, Davy looked Knowles in the eye. He smiled at the detective and said keeping his vehicle clean was very important to him. Knowles smiled back at him, at which point Davy looked back down at the floor. Then Davy cleared his throat and said again that he had not seen Crystal the night before and he hadn't even been in Conway. Knowles leaned forward across the table and asked if anybody could back up his story, and Davy said some friends had been with him, so yes. Davy fit Knowles' idea of the potential killer, but Knowles knew he still had to gather more information before he could determine Davy's guilt or innocence. The kid had been a little smug about cleaning his truck, but a lot of young men in the area went out of their way to keep their trucks looking really good. And Knowles knew a knife was most likely the murder weapon, but Davy carrying a pocket knife on him was not out of the ordinary because it was a pretty common practice amongst hunters and hikers in the area. So Knowles told Davy not to leave town and that police would be in touch if they needed more information. Then he walked out of the interrogation room, thanked the officers at the station for helping him, and headed back outside to his car. It had only been about 12 hours since Crystal's body had been discovered, but Knowles already felt like he was running out of time. He knew that the murder of a popular high school student could send panic through a small town like Conway, so he wanted to close the case as fast as possible and reassure everyone that their families were safe. But over the next several days, Knowles questioned all of Davy's friends, and they all corroborated his story that he had not seen Crystal or been in Conway on the night of her murder. And so Knowles started to feel like his chance to close this case quickly was slipping away. A week went by with no new leads in the investigation, and now Knowles found himself standing outside in a huge crowd of people gathered in the church cemetery who were desperate for answers. Over 1,000 people were there to attend Crystal's funeral, including almost every teenager who went to school with her. Knowles could hear crying throughout the crowd as the minister said his final prayer. Knowles and members of his team had come to the funeral to see if anything or anyone might stand out and offer them any sort of clue. But as Knowles watched Crystal's friends and family walk by her coffin to say their final goodbye, all he saw was a town in mourning. Crystal's death had affected everyone, and he knew her murder would stay with this community for decades to come. By the time Knowles left, he knew the funeral hadn't given him any new information to go on. In fact, it had just made it clear how difficult his job would be. In a town like Conway, where everybody seemed to know Crystal, the list of potential suspects was almost endless. So, not long after the funeral, Knowles reached out to state law enforcement and forensics experts in South Carolina for help. And together, they came up with a plan to narrow down Knowles' search. They decided they would use DNA testing. DNA testing is an investigative technique that uses biological evidence found at the crime scene or on a victim to connect a suspect to the crime or to rule out a potential suspect. At the time of Crystal's death, DNA testing was still a relatively new technique, and it hadn't been used yet to solve a murder case in the state of South Carolina. But Knowles wanted to use all of the tools available to him. So the police in Conway made a public announcement that they needed male volunteers to submit samples for DNA testing. Police said these samples would help them eliminate suspects and enable them to narrow down their search for Crystal's killer. Knowles hoped at least a few of Crystal's male classmates who'd been at the party with her would volunteer. But he was astonished when over 50 men in the community quickly agreed to provide DNA samples in the hope it would help the investigation. The DNA testing would be handled by the state, and Knowles was informed it could take months before they had all of the results. He was happy his team had taken another step in the investigation, but he wasn't about to just wait around for test results that might not even lead to the killer. So while he waited for the results, Knowles kept digging into Crystal's personal life. And in January of 1992, so about a month and a half after Crystal's funeral, Knowles discovered something that he thought was a major break in the case. On a cool January night, Knowles sat at his desk in the station reading through Crystal's school notebooks that had been retrieved from her locker. Knowles was exhausted because he and his team had been working around the clock on this case for months, but he refused to let that exhaustion get in the way of the promise he had made to Crystal and her mother. Knowles rubbed his eyes, picked up the mug on his desk, took a sip of coffee, and kept reading over the notebooks. He was looking for anything that might help his investigation, but as he read, he just started to feel a deep sense of sadness. Amidst Crystal's notes for her high school classes, he saw drawings she had doodled in the margins and little messages she'd written to herself. Flipping through the notebooks, all Knowles could think about was how young Crystal was and how full of hope she must have been. But then someone had robbed her of all of that, and that person was still walking free. Just then, something in one of the notebooks jumped out at Knowles. The name Andy Tyndall was written in the flowery handwriting of a teenager who might have a crush. So Knowles flipped through a few more pages, and he saw Andy's name again written in the same way. In the interviews that Knowles had conducted with Crystal's friends, Andy's name had never come up. But now Knowles wondered if Andy was the high school boy Crystal had hoped to see at the party. So during the following week, Knowles dug into Andy's background, but he discovered Andy wasn't a high school boy at all. He was a 31-year-old man who liked hanging out with high school girls. And Knowles also learned that Andy had come to Conway, South Carolina after committing a robbery in Alabama and violating his parole. And so for the first time in weeks, Knowles felt like he might have a real prime suspect. Knowles contacted some of Crystal's friends he'd already spoken to, and he asked them if they knew anything about Andy. And finally, he found one of Crystal's friends who was willing to talk. Knowles met with this girl at her house, and she told him that Andy was like a secret between some of the girls at school. She said he was handsome, charming, and he had muscles like a bodybuilder. She said she didn't know if Crystal and Andy had ever gone out, but Crystal had definitely met him, and she wouldn't have been surprised if Crystal did have a crush on him. That was the connection between Crystal and Andy that Knowles was looking for. And the fact that Andy had violated parole in another state was enough for police to bring him in. And so on January 21st, 1992, over 2 months after Crystal's murder, Knowles sat across from Andy in a small police interrogation room. But unlike Davy, the nervous teenage boy Knowles had questioned earlier in the investigation, Andy was totally calm and collected. Knowles stared at Andy across the table and asked him if he had killed Crystal. Andy didn't flinch. He just said he'd only met the girl one time, months before the murder, and had never seen her again. Knowles, who almost always kept his cool, started to get frustrated. He took a deep breath and he asked Andy why a 31-year-old man was hanging out with high school girls. But Andy said he had just talked to some of the high school girls when they'd ended up at the same events in town. Nothing more than that. Then Knowles took another breath and just stared at Andy, trying to get a read on him. Knowles wasn't sure if Andy was guilty, but his name was in Crystal's notebook and he was a known criminal, and Knowles didn't want to just let him walk. So Knowles leaned forward in his chair and asked if Andy would be willing to submit samples for DNA testing. Andy stared back at Knowles for a bit, and then in the same calm voice he'd had throughout the entire interview, he said he would do it. Andy's DNA samples would be added to the other DNA samples that state authorities were already testing from the volunteers around town. And in early February of 1992, almost 3 months after Crystal's murder, Knowles would finally see the results from those DNA tests. And Knowles' theory that the killer was a man who felt Crystal had wronged him in some way would be proven true. And Knowles would rediscover a detail from his investigation that would solidify the killer's motive. Based on DNA test results, evidence collected at the murder scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Crystal Todd in the early morning hours of November 17, 1991. At about 11:15 p.m. on November 16th, Crystal's killer cruised down the tree-lined road that cut right through Conway in his blue Plymouth Sundance car. He passed by the mall and glanced out the window to see if anyone was hanging out, but the parking lot was empty, so he kept on driving. It was getting late, but he really wanted to find a girl to spend some time with. Then he looked up the road ahead of him and saw a car coming to a stop at a red light. He looked closer and saw the vanity license plates that said C. Todd, and he started laughing. He knew that was Crystal's car, and if he could have picked one girl in town to be with right now, it would have been her. So the killer pulled up right next to Crystal's car and began honking. She didn't respond, so he leaned on his horn even harder, and this time it worked. And Crystal looked over at him and she smiled, he smiled back, and he felt his heart beat a little bit faster. Then he rolled down his window and she did the same, and then he asked her if she wanted to hang out and she said yes. And then the light turned green and he followed her into the middle school parking lot. The killer watched as Crystal walked past his car and climbed into his passenger seat. Once she was in the car, he started driving and they began talking about the party she had just gone to. As Crystal spoke, the killer began looking out the window, searching for the perfect spot away from all the lights in the center of town. And when those lights were far behind him in the rearview mirror and the road was so dark they could barely see the woods on either side, he pulled off the road and parked. Crystal asked him what he was doing, and he told her that it would be easier for them to talk if they weren't driving. His heart started beating faster and he was breathing heavily. He looked at Crystal and smiled. Then he took off his seatbelt, he leaned over the passenger seat and tried to kiss her. Crystal told him this is not what she wanted, but he didn't listen. Crystal tried to push him off of her and get out of the car, but she couldn't. She was trapped. Then the killer forced himself on Crystal and sexually assaulted her. Sometime after midnight, when Crystal had finally gotten free, she grabbed her shirt and jeans from the floorboard, she got out of the car, began getting dressed, and then she began screaming at the killer through the open passenger door. Inside the car, the killer seethed, and his head started pounding, and he just wanted her to stop screaming, but she wouldn't stop. So the killer opened the glove compartment and grabbed a knife with a locking blade that he kept in his car. Then he opened his door and he rushed around the car towards Crystal, who was still getting dressed. Before Crystal could react, he grabbed her shoulder and slammed the knife into her skull. Crystal felt the right half of her body go completely numb. Then the killer pulled the knife out and Crystal staggered forward in the road. The killer followed with his knife raised, and Crystal held up her left hand to try to stop him, but there was nothing she could do. He stabbed her in the chest and she fell down, but the killer kept going. The killer would stab Crystal 31 times, and some of the wounds were inflicted after she was clearly already dead. Finally, the killer stopped, looked at what he'd done, and started to panic. The road was dark, but in the moonlight, he could see where the road dropped into a ditch on the opposite side from where he had parked. So he grabbed Crystal under the arms, dragged her body across the road, and threw her in the ditch. Then he ran back to his car, slammed the door, and sped off down the road. And he didn't stop until he parked in front of his house. Before he got out, he looked over the car to see if there was anything Crystal had left behind, and he saw her keys on the floorboard of the passenger seat. He grabbed her keys, got out of the car, and ran across the porch to the front door. His hand was shaking, and his house key rattled the doorknob as he unlocked the door. Once he was inside, he ran to his room, and he hid Crystal's keys in a drawer. And when he looked down at his hands, he finally realized he was covered in blood. So he stripped down, ran to the bathroom, and took a shower. Afterwards, his hands were still trembling, but he was breathing a little easier. So he walked back to his bedroom and got dressed for bed. But before he could lie down, the phone rang. He figured it was his girlfriend calling to say goodnight, so he grabbed the phone. But when he answered, it was not his girlfriend, it was Crystal's mother, who was frantic because her daughter had not come home. Ken Register, who was one of Crystal's best friends since childhood, who was a pallbearer at Crystal's funeral, and who was the person who had comforted Crystal's mother after she found out her daughter had been killed, had been the one who murdered Crystal. It would turn out that Ken fit the description of the killer Knowles had first imagined, a young man who knew Crystal and who believed he had some reason to be angry with her. But the detail from early interviews that Knowles had rediscovered, the one that would clarify Ken's motive, was that Crystal and Ken had briefly dated years before the murder, and Crystal had broken up with him because she thought they were better off as friends. But Ken didn't see it that way, and he believed Crystal belonged to him. And his desire to have her for himself, no matter the cost, had grown over the years. And then, on the night of the murder, Ken was driving home from the go-kart track when he saw Crystal at the red light, and he decided that was the night they were going to be together. And when Crystal tried to push him off of her in the car, he flew into a violent rage. It would turn out Crystal's murder was the first murder case in South Carolina solved by using DNA evidence, because Ken had been one of the people in town who had quickly provided a DNA sample when police asked for volunteers, and Ken's DNA sample had linked him to the sexual assault and the murder. Ken would later suggest he had provided those samples despite being guilty because he didn't fully understand how DNA evidence could tie him to the crime. Ken would ultimately confess to the murder, he was found guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Then, in 2022, over 30 years after the murder, Ken came up for parole. But Crystal's friends, who still missed her dearly, started a petition to have Ken's parole denied. And Ken eventually just waived his right to a parole hearing, and as of May 2023, he remains in prison.
In the 1850s and 1860s, Edwin Booth was the man. He was this extremely famous American actor who basically anywhere he went in America, people would know who he was. He was extremely recognizable, a household name, an A-list celebrity through and through. But his acting prowess and his career and his fame, those are not the things we remember him for. In early 1865, when Edwin was 31 years old and was at the height of his acting fame, he walked into a New Jersey train station and walked through the building to the actual platform where the trains are. And as soon as he turned a corner and actually saw the train that he wanted to board, he very quickly realized that he probably was not going to get on that train. There was already this huge throng of people out on the platform pressed up against the side of this train, and they're all waving their arms around and yelling. And in the middle of this big group of people with his back pressed up against the train was the train's conductor, whose job was to sell tickets in addition to driving the train. But from Edwin's perspective, it seemed fairly obvious based on the conductor's body language and what some of the people in the crowd were yelling that there just weren't enough tickets. That's why this big unruly group had formed, because all these people were rushing forward trying to buy one of the last few tickets. Now, Edwin could have very easily just walked up and announced himself and shown his very famous face, and almost certainly he would have gotten a ticket. But to this point, Edwin had not been recognized in this train station, and so he wanted to keep a low profile, and so he decided against that idea. Instead, he decided he would just kind of join this big group and, try to flag down the conductor and try to buy one of these tickets, and if he didn't, so be it. And so Edwin, instead of going to the back of this group, he went around to the right side, close up against the side of the train, and right as he got to the outside of the group and he turned in towards the group, he looked up at where the conductor was and he saw the conductor turning around and walking back into the train. He'd clearly sold all of his tickets, and so anyone who had not purchased one yet, like Edwin, they were out of luck. They'd have to wait for the next train. Edwin was about to just walk away and wait for the next train when he noticed the crowd in front of him. They didn't disperse like he was doing. Instead, they all seemed to kind of surge forward towards the train, which was now moving. And as they pushed forward as if they were going to jump onto this train, even though they didn't have tickets, one man who was towards the front of this group, right up against the train, he falls to the ground and gets trapped halfway under the train. His lower half was literally on the tracks under the train, and his upper half is now under this big crowd of people that are now trampling him. And so Edwin can see very clearly that if someone does not grab this guy and pull him out soon, he's gonna get run over by the train. And so Edwin, without any hesitation, he jumps forward onto the ground on the platform and he reaches his hand out through the feet of all these people in this crowd and he grabs the collar of the guy who had fallen and he pulls him. And as he's pulling him, this guy who's on his back, he starts pushing with his legs and his feet. And within about a fraction of a second, they yank him out from under the train. And the guy who had fallen and Edwin are lying on their backs on the platform. And before they could even talk to each other, they sat up and watched as a big train wheel rolled over that piece of track where this guy had just been laying. Edwin had saved his life. The guy he had saved was a 21-year-old named Robert. And so the two of them, they stand up and they face each other for the first time. And when Robert sees Edwin, he gasps because this is Edwin Booth, the mega celebrity. He could not believe that was the guy who had just saved him. And while Robert was very thankful, he also was just totally dumbfounded at the absurdity of the situation he was in. And so eventually Edwin just says, hey, I'm glad I was here to help you. No big deal. Next time be more careful. And then at some point the men just shook hands and parted ways. Edwin would eventually get on the next train and he would go wherever it was he needed to go. And before long, his very busy schedule kind of occupied his mind and he had kind of forgotten about what happened on the train platform. But a few days later, Edwin got a letter in the mail from a very high-ranking government official thanking him for saving Robert's life, because it would turn out Robert Lincoln was the eldest son of the then President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. Now, to be clear, Edwin was extremely famous and had lots and lots of influence and knew lots of very important people, but he had never had any interaction with anyone in the Lincoln family before he met Robert on the train platform. So it was just a crazy coincidence that this mega celebrity happened to save the life of the president's son. But this coincidence was nothing compared to the coincidence that occurred next. On the evening of April 14th, 1865, so roughly 3 months after Edwin saved Robert, Robert's father, President Lincoln, sat down in a private seating area to watch a play at a Washington, D.C. theater. During the production at around 10:15 p.m., a man snuck into the private seating area and shot the president to death. The killer was Edwin's younger brother, John Wilkes Booth. This assassination had nothing to do with Edwin or his interaction with Robert on the train platform. This was an assassination that was formulated and carried out completely independently, meaning it was purely coincidence that just a few months after Edwin saved a Lincoln's life, his own brother took a Lincoln's life.
Our next story is called The Lamp.
In 2004, Mitch was in his final semester at a college in Louisiana when he met another senior, a wonderful young lady named Kayla. From the instant he saw her, he knew he was in love. She played hard to get at first, but after several months, he won her over. After graduation, the pair stayed in Louisiana and moved in together while they got their careers off the ground. 2 years later, the pair got married, and almost immediately, Kayla got pregnant. At the time, Mitch's career was really starting to take off, which allowed Kayla to stay at home and take some time off. By the time their daughter was born, Mitch was making so much money that Kayla decided to just stay home and be a full-time mom. A couple years later, Kayla got pregnant again, and by the time their daughter was 2 years old, they had their son. Mitch adored his children. Every morning before he went to work, he would sneak into their room and he would watch them sleep. And then in the evenings, they would have these big family sit-down meals and then play games together until bedtime. Mitch's life was perfect. Shortly after his son's birth, Mitch was lounging on the couch in his TV room when he noticed out of the corner of his eye the red lamp in the corner of the room. It just looked funny. It was almost like the light itself was blurry, but when he looked a little bit closer at it, the entire lamp looked blurry. And so Mitch looked around the room and nothing else was blurry. He rubbed his eyes and looked back over at this lamp and it was still blurry. He turned the TV off and walked over to the lamp, and even though he was right in front of it, the lamp was still blurry. And Mitch didn't have bad eyesight, and so he's thinking, is there something wrong with me? Am I having a stroke? Do I have an aneurysm? Is there some sort of illness here that's making me see this lamp blurry when it's really not? But Mitch told himself he was healthy and that whatever this was, it was an anomaly and nothing to worry about. And so he went back over to the couch, turned the TV back on, and tried to ignore the lamp. But as he was watching TV, out of his peripheral vision, he couldn't help but notice this weird blurry lamp. And so finally, he turned the TV off again, and he turned to look at this lamp. And now, in addition to being blurry, it appeared to be upside down. Now Mitch was genuinely concerned that there was something wrong with him because, again, nothing else in the entire room was blurry or upside down. It was just this lamp. And so a few minutes later, his wife and his kids came home, and Mitch decided he would not tell them about this lamp. He didn't want to alarm them. He figures he will get to the bottom of this blurry lamp, and then he will tell his wife and kids. And so that night, the family has a sit-down meal, and then afterwards they play some games together, and then everybody goes upstairs and goes to sleep. But after everyone had gone to sleep, Mitch was just laying in bed thinking about this lamp. And so finally, he snuck out of his bed and went downstairs to the TV room, and he sat on the couch and he just stared at this lamp. And for hours and hours, he just fixated himself on this lamp, watching it kind of morph around and turn upside down and get blurrier and blurrier by the second. The next day, Kayla found Mitch lying on the couch, passed out, and she asked him if he was okay. And again, Mitch didn't tell her about this lamp that was still blurry. He just told her that he wasn't feeling well and he was not going to go to work that day. But Mitch didn't go to work for 3 more days. He just sat on the couch and stared at this lamp. And Kayla obviously picked up on this strange behavior and kept poking and prodding to get more information about what was going on. But Mitch never told her the truth about this lamp. He just kept telling her he felt sick. She urged him to go see a doctor, but Mitch told her it would be fine, he'd get better. And then over time, as this lamp continued to morph and get bigger and get stranger and stranger, Mitch suddenly was unable to respond to his wife. He became totally unresponsive. And so obviously his wife became desperate and called the doctor. And as she's on the phone with the doctor trying to get advice about what to do, Mitch realizes the lamp is now growing in leaps and bounds. And before long, the lamp is the entire size of the room, and all he can see is the red color of this lamp. And then Mitch starts to hear these voices, these screams coming from somewhere in the distance. And then he feels this blinding pain in his head. And then he opens his eyes and he looks up and he sees he's laying on the sidewalk next to one of the buildings at his college in Louisiana. And surrounding him is this crowd of people with wide eyes that are staring at him. Mitch had no idea what was going on, and so he naturally just began scanning the crowd, looking for Kayla and his kids to try to figure out, how he got here. But before he could ask any questions and before he could find his wife and kids, a police officer ran through the crowd, picked him up and ran him over to his police car, put him in the back, and then began driving away. And so while Mitch is in the back of this police car, he turns to the officer and he says, "What's going on?" And the officer would tell him he was attacked by a huge college football player. He got hit in the head and he fell backwards and he hit his head again and he fell unconscious. Mitch asked the officer where his wife and kids were, and the cop said he had no idea. And that's when it clicked for Mitch. The lamp wasn't real. Neither was his wife, neither was his daughter, neither was his son, neither was his life. For the past 10 years, it was all a hallucination while he was unconscious after getting attacked. Mitch was brought to the hospital where he would make a full physical recovery, but after being released, he was horribly depressed, and he had to get intense therapy to basically grieve for the loss of his family that never existed. These days, Mitch says he can barely remember what his family even looked like, but periodically in his dreams, he will catch a glimpse of his son in his peripheral vision, and his son is perpetually 5 years old, and he's trying to talk to his father, but Mitch can never understand what he says.
The next and final story of today's episode is called What's He Hiding?
In 2017, Daniel Beckwith was a 27-year-old genius hacker and prolific Bitcoin day trader. He was living in his modest childhood home in Bethesda, Maryland, with a multi-million-dollar fortune to his name. And he was hiding something major in his basement that when it was discovered by authorities, he would be convicted of one of the rarest criminal charges in the American legal justice system. But to understand this story, we have to go back to the beginning. Daniel was born in 1991 to his eccentric and brilliant parents, Linda and David. He would be their only child. David was a PhD and an accomplished opera singer that had trained under a famous French composer, and he had also performed at the White House. Linda was a Columbia Law School trained lawyer who at one time had been a government attorney, but she gave it up because she described it as a scummy profession, and she became a vocalist like her husband. When Daniel was just a toddler, he learned how to read, so it was clear he had unusually high intellect, which Linda guarded fiercely. She decided that public schools were not capable of teaching her son, and so she decided she would homeschool him. By the time Daniel was just 5 years old, he was consuming entire novels, and shortly after that, he was able to break down and reprogram his PlayStation. But despite his incredible intelligence, Daniel had a really lonely childhood. He was rarely allowed to go outside and play with other kids, and on the rare chance that he was, his parents always hovered around him the entire time. And few playmates, or adults for that matter, ever came inside of Daniel's house because Daniel's parents were big-time hoarders. You couldn't take 2 steps into that house before knocking into a big stack of papers or books or old food containers. In 2000, when Daniel was 9 years old, his father was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, which left Linda, his mother, to take care of both of them. And in that time, Linda became obsessed with protecting their property. And so anytime anyone walked in front of their house, just near their property, she would run outside and yell at them until they ran away. But despite their eccentricities, it was clear to anybody that knew the Beckwith family that Linda and David just adored Daniel. They just could not give him any space. One neighbor recalled seeing the 3 Beckwiths out trick-or-treating one year, all wearing these same matching hamster outfits. And this was well into Daniel's teenage years. Daniel loved his parents, but it was in those later teenage years that he started to realize just how smothering they really were, and so he began looking for other places to connect with new people. And he found a new community on an online forum called 4chan. There, Daniel got to reinvent himself. He adopted this kind of tough guy, genius persona where he bragged about finishing most of high school by the time he was 15, and that nowadays he just blows stuff up in his backyard to test his chemistry know-how. But over the years of posting on this channel, Daniel would occasionally let his guard down, and he would talk about something that was really close to him that pervaded his thoughts at all times and would ultimately be his downfall, and that was his extreme fear of death. Daniel's isolation looked like it might come to an end in 2010 when he enrolled at the University of Illinois to study computer science and electrical engineering. His parents dropped him off at the Amtrak train station with all of his stuff for college. They said their goodbyes. Daniel hopped on the train and he waved to them as they disappeared, and he likened that experience to being set free. It was the first time he was going to be without his parents for any amount of time. But unfortunately, after only being at school for a couple of months, he had to go right back home again because his mother was diagnosed with cancer. And she had hid it from Daniel. In fact, she had hid it from everyone and not even seen a doctor. And so when Daniel got home, she was in really bad shape and she passed away 2 weeks later. Including Daniel, only 3 people showed up for her funeral. And so Daniel, with his mismatched clothes and his pants that were too short, he gave his mother's eulogy, and in it, he just looked dazed and he actually said, "I feel lost." And then shortly after Daniel went back to school, his father began declining rapidly from Parkinson's disease, and so Daniel had to put him into assisted living. And so living by himself at his apartment in college, Daniel was overcome with grief, and now more than ever, he was just terrified of death because now he had seen it up close with his mother and he was watching his father wither away. And so he went back on 4chan and he began talking about taking a more defensive position against his own death. What that translated to is Daniel began researching what the most common killers were for people his age. And he discovered that car accidents were a big killer. And so he reinforced all the doors of his car with Kevlar plates, and anytime he drove it, he wore a Kevlar vest, which he believed protected him from blunt force trauma in the event of a crash. Knowing that cancer was a big killer, he went out and removed every mole on his body as a preventative measure. But what Daniel viewed as the biggest threat to his life was not something that statisticians would tell you is something people his age or people in his country should be worried about, and that was a nuclear attack on the United States. Daniel believed it was imminent. Daniel believed the only way he could protect himself was to build a proper fallout shelter. And because his mother had left him a multi-million-dollar trust fund, he had the means to construct one. And so he left college and went back to his home. He went down into the basement and he picked a spot right in the middle of the ground and he began digging. Over the next 2 years, Daniel spent part of his time living at college, being a really good student, and the other half of his time was spent living at his family home, hiring different contractors to come in and dig out this massive labyrinth of tunnels underneath his property. But in 2012, his schoolwork and his tunnel work had to come to a complete stop because he got in trouble with the law. Professors at Daniel's school began reporting that somebody was sneaking into their office, hacking into their computer, and then sending these really inappropriate and embarrassing emails to everybody in their contact list, which was primarily former and current students and faculty. And then whoever it was that was hacking their computer was then supergluing their door shut. After several months of investigating, the police finally got a suspect when students on campus said, yeah, Daniel Beckwith is actually a prolific hacker. And he just spoke at a hacker conference, so he seems like someone who would be capable of doing this. And so a detective went to Daniel's apartment to pay him a casual visit, but Daniel wasn't there or didn't come to the door, and the detective looked down and saw a package that was sitting there that was addressed to S. Loomis Detweiler. The detective believed this could be an alias for Daniel Beckwith, and so he went back and they ran that name, and sure enough, it was connected to an online persona that had recently been bragging about breaking into their professors' offices and hacking into their emails. So the police used this information to attain a search warrant. They went back to Daniel's apartment. He wasn't there. They used the key they had been given for the unit. They went inside and they're hit with just this ridiculous mess of an apartment. It looked exactly like Daniel's home growing up, with stacks of papers and books and wires and computer equipment and trash and old food containers. And there was just this dirty mattress sitting right in the middle of the apartment with no sheets on it. And in the back, on top of a mini fridge, was Daniel's laptop. It was open and it was unsecured, so they logged into it, cloned his hard drive, and left. And using the information that was contained on this hard drive, detectives were able to, without a doubt, connect Daniel to the vandalism and hacking that had been taking place at his college. Daniel was arrested and charged with a number of serious felonies, but shortly before his trial, Daniel struck a plea deal and then immediately took to Reddit to tell the world that he fully expected the state governor to pardon him because he had made a number of significant contributions to his campaign. But that pardon never came. However, Daniel's sentence was remarkably light. He was ordered to pay $23,000 in restitution to the college and then was given 2 years of probation. Daniel was expelled from his school, and so he moved back into his childhood home where he lived alone full-time. Once home, Daniel focused his efforts on this bunker he was building in his basement, which by now was a fairly large series of tunnels that zigged and zagged in different directions well beyond his property lines. Once Daniel hired a couple good contractors to continue to expand this bunker, he turned his attention to a new activity, Bitcoin trading. And in relative short order, Daniel became extremely good at this and made millions of dollars. By 2015, Daniel was off probation. His bunker was almost completely built out, although he did have plans at some point to hire more people and continue to expand it. And in terms of Bitcoin day trading, he wasn't doing it as much because he had made so much money. Now he just spent his time sitting inside of his bunker, live streaming on this new website called Blab about his investment prowess. And every time Daniel live streamed, he was cautious to never reveal his identity. And so he used the username 3-Alarm Lamp Scooter, and he wore a large fire protection hood over his face, and he used a voice changer. Within his small but avid following on Blab, there was one 19-year-old named Askia Kafra who completely idolized Daniel, even though he only knew him as 3-Alarm. Askia was from a middle-class home, and he was the son of immigrants from Trinidad. He also lived only 15 minutes away from Daniel, but he didn't know that because Daniel never gave up where he lived because he was so obsessed with protecting himself against a potential nuclear attack. He just told people he lived in some underground bunker in the middle of Virginia somewhere. Askia longed to be successful and rich, which is part of the reason he idolized Daniel so much. When he was 18 years old, he received a $100,000 settlement for a lead poisoning case, and he for a second got to live the life of someone rich and famous, and he blew it immediately on expensive dinners and rented Mercedes and BMW cars. And once the money was all gone, he was certain he could get it all back. And his big plan is he was going to build an app called Equity Shark, which is basically crowdfunding that allowed people to invest small amounts of money into new promising startups. And he believed this app was going to be the way he made not millions, but billions of dollars. But he didn't have any real money to fund this app. And so he and his business partner applied for a $100,000 grant for young entrepreneurs that have dropped out of college, something Askia had just done, and they were certain they were going to get this grant. But despite Askia's confidence, he was far from a sure bet for this money, because Askia still had many of the blind spots of someone still learning how to become an adult. And one of his biggest blind spots was how quick he was to trust people. And so it was shortly after Askia and his business partner had applied for this $100,000 grant that Askia came across Daniel on Blab, and he was so taken with him, and he's got all this money, and he's so successful. And that's when Daniel told his followers that he was open to new investments. And so Askia, who wanted to get closer to Daniel and figured he could use some additional money because even when they got this $100,000 grant, they would need more money to build the business, he decided he would ask Daniel if he and his business partner could pitch him on Equity Shark. And Daniel agreed. And so in June of 2016, Askia and his business partner went to this hookah bar that was about 20 minutes away from Askia's home, and there they sat, waiting for 3-Alarm Lamp Scooter to walk through the door. And they didn't know what he was going to look like because whenever they saw him on his live streams, he had that big fire protection hood on. But as soon as Daniel walked through the door, they immediately knew it was him because he had this comically bulky shirt on where it was obvious he had a bulletproof vest on. And so this guy with the bulletproof vest walks over, introduces himself as 3-Alarm, aka Daniel. And so by now, Askia and his business partner are very accustomed to 3-Alarm's eccentricities like his bulletproof vest. They just kind of overlook it and begin pitching him on Equity Shark. And they tell him that the success of the company, they believe, is hinged on this $100,000 grant that they explained they are certain to get. They meet all the parameters. They are exactly what they're looking for. And at the end of the conversation, Daniel was convinced that not only were they going to get this $100,000 grant, but that Equity Shark seemed like a great investment. And so after a number of follow-on meetings, Daniel ultimately committed $5,000 to Equity Shark, and he told Askia that they would have to pay him back with the funds from the $100,000 grant, or if for some reason that didn't come through, Askia and his business partner would have to find another way to pay back Daniel. Askia and his business partner were totally thrilled. They felt like that $100,000 grant is a done deal, so there's no risk to this investment by Daniel. And shortly after they secured the $5,000, the manager of the $100,000 grant program called Askia and said, hey, you guys have made it to the second round of applicants. We need you to fly out to San Francisco and pitch your company to us. And so they're totally excited. They tell Daniel that everything's progressing exactly as they planned, and they fly out to the West Coast, but they book their flight to LAX, not to the airport in San Francisco. So they land 400 miles south of where they needed to be. And so they're cussing themselves for being so stupid about this, and they realize they can't even rent a car. They're not old enough to rent a car. But they were old enough to rent a U-Haul. So they rent this huge U-Haul and they start bombing up the coast towards San Francisco to make this meeting in time, but they plugged the wrong address into their GPS and did not go to the right building. They went in the opposite direction. And so by the time they finally got all the way back to the meeting place in San Francisco, it was too late, and the manager that was waiting for them was clearly upset about it and said, just go home, we'll be in touch by phone. Back home, Askia was totally embarrassed when he told Daniel about their botched trip, and he was convinced that they were not going to get the grant now because of how badly they had screwed up the meeting. And so Askia began asking Daniel if he would give them more money, because maybe if they use that additional money to bolster the app and make it more appealing, they will have a better chance at getting that $100,000 grant. Daniel eventually said he would commit more money, but Askia picked up that he was really hesitant and just seemed not to be very interested in Equity Shark anymore. And so Askia, hoping to stay in Daniel's good graces and wanting to make sure he was confident in this investment, he said, hey, let me do something for you. I heard on one of the channels online that you're looking to expand some of the tunnels inside of your bunker. Let me do that for you. Daniel, who was looking to expand his bunker, was eager to hire Askia. But he told him that if you're going to work for me, there's going to be heavy restrictions on how this goes. Because it's a very secret location. I don't want this to leak out, where my bunker is, because as you know, there's going to be a nuclear attack on the United States any day. And my bunker is one of the only places that's going to be safe. Askia said that was totally fine. He would do whatever Daniel needed. So on January 28th, 2017, just after 2 a.m., Askia sat outside his house waiting for some car to come pick him up. And at some point, Daniel showed up in a minivan, and he walked up to Askia, he let him into the van, and then he put goggles that were blacked out on his head. And then Daniel drove around in loops up on the highway and background neighborhoods, giving the impression to Askia that they were actually going somewhere far outside of Maryland, but really they were only going 15 minutes away to Daniel's actual house. And when they got to Daniel's house, Daniel made Askia keep the goggles on. Daniel got out and he led Askia by a string into the house. And once they got inside, Daniel had to carefully walk him around all the junk that was piled up all over the house. They made their way all the way to the back. They went down the stairs into the basement where Daniel had intentionally created this unbelievable maze all over the basement floor with chicken wire and stacks of bikes and books and more junk. It was designed so anybody who was working inside of the tunnels, that even once they came out of the exit, wouldn't even know how to get out of the basement. And finally, after bringing Askia all the way through this maze, he stopped him right in front of this hole in the ground that was the entrance into the underground tunnels. And at that point, he told Askia to remove his goggles. Daniel told him to hop down and take a look. So Askia hopped down and he's looking around and he's seeing these massive tunnel systems pushing out in all directions, and all of it is extremely well lit. And he couldn't believe what he was looking at. And he's looking at Daniel like, how far does this go? And Daniel said, it's huge. It was at this point that Daniel handed down to Askia a pickaxe, a shovel, and a hard hat. And he explained to him that anytime you're in the tunnels, I'm going to have to cover over this hole, because I can't even have you in the basement. It's too much of a security threat for me. And in fact, I'd prefer it if you worked multiple days in a row, because anytime you leave, we're going to have to do the whole blindfold thing. And so you should anticipate living in the tunnels for days at a stretch. But don't worry, there's a mattress down there, there's Wi-Fi, everything's well lit up, and there's a 5-gallon bucket if you need to go to the bathroom. And so Askia, who trusted Daniel, didn't love this setup, but in a weird way, he was just kind of excited to be a part of this guy's life, this guy who he believed was just this really amazing person. And so over the following winter and spring, Askia would make the blindfold commute all the way to Daniel's house 15 minutes away, and then he would spend multiple days down in the tunnel chiseling away into these different tunnels that Daniel wanted expanded. But as well as it was going working for Daniel, Askia was dealt some bad news at the end of the spring when it turned out Equity Shark was turned down for that $100,000 grant. Askia was surprised, he was crushed, and he now knew he would have to pay back that $5,000 that Daniel had invested in Equity Shark, because he wasn't getting it from the $100,000 anymore. And so he asked Daniel if he could increase his hours in the tunnel to try to pay back that debt. Daniel agreed, and so on September 10th, Askia was back at Daniel's house, and he was down inside the tunnels in one of the lowest sections that required squeezing through a very narrow section that Askia had actually texted his friends about and said that section made him really claustrophobic, but he had to do it. He needed to pay back the debt. And so later that day at 4 p.m., when Askia was down in that lower section, the power in the tunnel suddenly went completely out. So it's pitch black. And so Daniel, who was upstairs, recognized it happened. And so he navigated through all the junk upstairs, came downstairs, navigated the maze all the way to the circuit breaker in the basement, and he flipped the switch. And the power went on, but Daniel heard a loud buzzing sound coming from upstairs in the kitchen. And so worried that could be an electrical fire, he turned back off the circuit breaker, putting Askia back in total darkness down deep inside of this tunnel. And Daniel went back through this really epic maze in the basement, went up the stairs into the kitchen to investigate the buzzing sound. And as soon as he left the basement, he could smell smoke. And he turned around and looked down into the basement, and he could clearly see smoke was filling the basement. And so Daniel ran downstairs and he yelled out for Askia, and somewhere way down in the tunnels, he heard Askia yell out, "Hey dude, what's going on?" And Daniel's like, "Come on, you gotta get out of there." But he was totally overcome with smoke, and Daniel had to run back upstairs, ran outside, he caught his breath, and then he charged back into the house, down into the basement. But as soon as he got to the bottom of the stairs, he didn't see Askia, but he saw flames leaping out of the entrance into the tunnels. And he knew Askia was down there, and he's screaming for Askia to get out, but he didn't hear from him. And at some point, Daniel just had to turn around and leave because he was totally overcome with the heat and the smoke. A neighbor saw Daniel come running out. They saw the smoke coming out of his house, and so they called 911. And so while Daniel paced outside screaming for Askia, Askia is down in total darkness. There's smoke filling up the tunnels, and he began making his way across that very tight section. But once he got out of there, he had no idea where to go because this tunnel system was huge and all the power was out, so it's pitch black, and there's smoke inside of the tunnel. And so he desperately starts crawling all over the tunnel. He's hitting dead ends. And finally, miraculously, he makes it to the exit of the tunnels. Everything around him is on fire. He leaps out, but now he's in a basement that's covered in smoke. And every time he had been led to that point in the basement, he had been blindfolded. He didn't know how to navigate the maze. And so he's looking out and it's all smoky. And all he can see is there's one window on the far side that he might be able to get to. And so he starts leaping over the chicken wire and the bikes and he sneaks past a furnace. And it's just flames and smoke all around him. And he gets to this little shimmer of light, which is the window, except he realizes there have been metal bars placed in front of it. There's no way to get through it. But in his desperation, he grabbed a rolly chair and he put it in front. He climbed on top and he managed to break the glass, but then he couldn't get through the bars. And eventually, after a number of agonizing minutes, he fell backwards and was consumed by the flames. After the fire was finally put out and Askia's body was finally found inside of the basement underneath that window, investigators didn't understand how Askia couldn't have gotten out of the basement. And Daniel tried to lie about it and say, oh, well, he might have been asleep. That's his bachelor pad down there. But eventually, as investigators were looking for the cause of the fire, they uncovered the entrance to this massive tunnel system. And that's when they realized Daniel had put Askia effectively into a death trap. When the fire started, Askia was at the bottom of this tunnel system, and so he had to navigate all the way back up to the top, killing all this precious time as the fire grows, and then he finally got into the basement, and there's flames everywhere, but he has no idea how to navigate the maze Daniel had made down there. And so he managed to get to the window because it was the only thing he could see, but of course Daniel had put bars in front of it, and so Askia had nowhere else to go, and he just died. The investigators would point out that where he died, he was only 2 steps away from almost certain safety. He just didn't know it. After an 8-month investigation, prosecutors charged Daniel with involuntary manslaughter as well as one of the rarest charges in the American justice system. It's called second-degree depraved heart murder, where Daniel's disregard for human life was so extreme it amounted to willful killing. And so he was sentenced to 9 years in prison.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please replace the Amazon Music Follow Buttons mouthwash with glass cleaner. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. We have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the Mr. Ballin Foundation that honors and supports victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the Mr. Ballin Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in